I think, yeah, as Pete said, we're doing two meetings, and one is going to be more focused on sort of general state capitalism theory and Russia and so on. Is that right, Gareth? I think that's right. Um,
Yeah.
okay, and this one is more about East Asia, which obviously is the sort of main topic of the book. Um, I suppose I could say something about where the book came from and what the book is trying to address and what state capitalism theory is trying to address. Um, I mean, for me, the book came from being inspired by some Korean comrades mainly who had been applying the sort of IS tradition ideas and state capitalism theory to East Asia, to North Korea, to China, and so on, and their work was not really being seen anywhere else or being translated. So part of the purpose of the book was to translate some of that work and make it available, which I think in the end it was successful with, although it was a long journey to get there. Um, and I suppose also I was kind of just inspired by the idea that state capitalism theory, as it had been developed by Tony Cliff and then applied in various ways in the IS tradition, was sort of had not really fully kind of been utilized as much as it could be actually in terms of analyzing various parts of the world, and that it had a lot to offer more than just understanding the Soviet Union, which I guess is where it really comes from. Um, so I think, yes, what is the problem that state capitalism theory tries to address? Well, the first one, yeah, I've just said it really, which is for decades, people on the revolutionary left strove to understand the Soviet Union and then its satellite countries in various ways. And there were various traditions which developed versions of state capitalism theory in trying to understand Soviet Union as a type of capitalism. Um, and I think that became, state capitalism theory or theories became an important way for non-Stalinist socialists to understand those Stalinist regimes. Um, However, I think, it's important to say that state capitalism theory has other uses and other meanings. And I think that in this book, hopefully it shows how it can be applied not only to understanding the Stalinist countries, but to helping to understand the successful, I mean, in inverted commas, successful economic development of certain post-colonial countries, particularly in East Asia. And so, as I've sort of stated, I guess, in the blurb of this book and in the introduction, the countries of East Asia, and I'm including in this China, Korea, two Koreas, Taiwan, um, some of the smaller like tigers like Singapore, those countries went through a absolutely almost, you could say, incomprehensible transformation in the second half of the 20th century in a very, very short period of time, a very kind of compressed period of modernization, urbanization, industrialization. Um, and you can find, even with quite a superficial look, you can see that this industrial transformation of East Asian societies had quite marked similarities across a range of very different political regimes, right? From Imperial Japan before 1945 through communist China, in inverted commas, communist, post-colonial North Korea, and of course even South Korea, which was supposedly some kind of liberal market capitalist country. So in this edited volume, the various different authors are all essentially arguing that these great transformations of East Asian countries mainly in the late 20th century were all capitalist transformations in which the state played a leading role, or in some cases a kind of exclusive role, right, in which it took on the role of capitalist, or what Cliff called bureaucratic state capitalism. But that there's a sort of range of different kinds of state capitalism at play, and that these state capitalisms sort of have a historical background which we have to take into account as well, where they emerge from. I'll say something about that in a minute. Um, I guess one of the things that I wanted to say here was that a book like this obviously is making an argument for something, but it's also kind of arguing against other explanations as well. I mean, I guess it's arguing fairly explicitly against the sort of standard left or Stalinist approach to so-called socialist countries like, North Korea and China and Vietnam, although Vietnam doesn't really come up in the book, but it's arguing against the standard explanation that these are, these are or were socialist countries, and that they are socialist because of nationalization, economic planning, and social provisions and so on. It's arguing against that idea. The book is also explicitly arguing against another kind of theory of development, which is developmental state theory. In fact, there's a whole chapter which deals with this in relation to China. And I mean, for those who maybe don't know, I mean, developmental state theory sort of I guess some time ago became probably the most popular or most, yeah, I guess that would be fair to say, probably dominant um, within development studies. And it's kind of, I guess, it's a sort of institutional, somewhat kind of Weberian explanation of why some countries have been successful in developing, and it sort of idealizes the post-war Japanese state, as the ideal kind of state to intervene in developing countries, and direct them towards capitalist economic development, I suppose. So it's arguing against that as well, because quite a few people have argued now that China is another sort of, archetypal developmental state. I suppose I didn't think about this that much at the time of the book, but another thing that it is, I guess, implicitly arguing against is dependency theory. I mean, the idea that, that was obviously popular mainly, I guess, in the 60s and 70s, that that capitalism meant that some parts of the world could not be developed and that they were forever in some way subordinate, and that there was a very kind of strict, I suppose, a very strict kind of international division of labor and so on. But what happened in East Asia in the late 20th century shows that doesn't really work. And I think looking at it through state capitalism theory can provide a better explanation of what was actually happening. I mean, if we go back, you look at actually what Tony Cliff wrote in his article on permanent revolution in 1963. This was an article in which he talked about something called deflected state capitalist permanent revolution. Very snappy name for a theory, but anyway, effectively what he was arguing, as I understand it, was that there were a number of countries in which the sort of road to capitalist modernization was opened up by a kind of revolution from above, a state capitalist revolution. And he included within that not just bureaucratic state capitalist countries, but also a whole series of kind of post-colonial nationalist regimes like, Egypt and so on, which went down this path, at least to some extent, with not necessarily with the state standing in to become the main capitalist, but went some of the way down that road. So this is an idea that has been around, but it was not one that was developed by Tony Cliff, as far as I know. That was the only article, as far as I know, where he sort of put forward this idea to some extent. So I don't. Yeah, the rest of the time, I'm going to just give us sort of some ideas of a bit of an idea of some of the things that are in the book as illustrations of this. I said that I would say something about the historical background to this. So I think that's quite important. What's the historical, evolution of East Asian state capitalism or state capitalisms? So we're not talking about one, fixed type. I think in the in post-colonial East Asia, i.e. after 1945, you can see two main sources of influence. One is the Japanese late development model, which began with the Meiji Restoration of 1868, and the other, certainly for China and North Korea, is Soviet industrialization. Obviously, is the other state capitalist model. So, when it comes to the first of those, the Japanese model, I mean, it was not just a model in terms of practices and ideology and so on. It was actually physical infrastructure on the ground in East Asia that was very much had been very much created by the Japanese imperial state alongside these big Japanese conglomerates called Zaibatsu. And if you look at sort of some of the foundational, the foundational heavy industry of the People's Republic of China or the DPRK, North Korea, it is basically huge Japanese factories like the Anshan Steel Complex in northeastern China or the Hungnam Chemical Complex on the east coast of North Korea. So there's a sort of physical legacy which helped to, provide the foundations for state capitalism. Um, I mean, ideologically, did Japan contribute something to this? Yes, to some extent. I mean, um, obviously, both North Korea and China very much disavowed the Japanese colonial past and tried to sort of what's the right word, purge it as much as possible from their sort of vocabulary and practices and ideology. But there definitely are traces of it there in terms of the kind of whole notion of collective sacrifice, the systems of mass mobilization which existed in the late Japanese Empire and which then were kind of reanimated in new forms in China and North Korea in the 40s and 50s. And which, of course, in North Korea, you still see this kind of mass mobilization society. Um, but talk about the second kind of influence from the experience of Soviet industrialization. So, I mean, the transplantation of state capitalist ideas and practices from the Soviet Union came through multiple routes into East Asia. In the case of North Korea, as people probably know, it was occupied by the Soviet Union for 3 years and continued to be heavily dependent on the Soviet Union right through the 1950s and even well beyond that. Um, but of course, the Soviets sent huge numbers of advisors, experts, engineers into North Korea. They also engaged in, well, the North Koreans and the Soviets engaged together in a mass sort of program of translation of Soviet books and journal articles and so on. And there was, of course, in some cases, quite direct scrutiny and intervention from the Soviet, from Stalin's party state apparatus at times in North Korea. Um, so yeah, that's to say something about where this comes from. Um, I'm going to try to say some brief things just by way of kind of illustration about what the kind of state capitalist systems in North Korea in the early years and also in China in the early years. This is drawing on a couple of chapters from the book. The chapter on North Korea is by South Korean socialist Ha Young Kim, and she's really focusing a lot on the way in which consumption was subordinated to accumulation in North Korea's model of industrialization. I mean, if anyone's familiar at all with development under Stalin, industrialization under Stalin in the 1930s, it's very much drawing from that playbook. Although interestingly, because this book also covers, South Korea, you can actually see quite a lot of parallels there as well. I mean, in the 1960s, the South Korean dictator Park Chung-hee also very much pursued a policy of subordinating consumption to accumulation in many, many different ways, sometimes explicitly, sometimes implicitly. I mean, even to the extent of just exporting hundreds of thousands of Koreans to other countries to get them out of the place. Um, yeah, I mean, some illustrations of this. Kim Il-sung took an extreme sort of heavy industry first line in the late 1950s, again drawing on what Stalin had done in the Soviet Union in the first 5-year plan, which saw 83% of industrial investment go into heavy industry in the first 5-year plan. So bear in mind, this is a country, struggling to recover from a very devastating war in which it's had trouble feeding everyone, it's had trouble clothing everyone, it's had trouble providing housing for everyone, let alone more, sophisticated consumption items. And yet it put its 83% of its investment into heavy industry, not into light industry, which would provide those things which could improve people's everyday lives. But it actually got the ratio of investment in heavy industry got higher. By 1970, it was at 88%. So consumption was consistently subordinated to investment. Uh, I mean, so if you look at it just in terms of investment, by 1984, it was actually still increasing the ratio of investment to consumption. 35% of gross national product in 1984 was being reinvested. Um, Another part of sort of North Korea's drive for accumulation, you could say, and I think you can say it's a form of primitive accumulation, what Marx talked about in it is in Capital. Is it in Capital Volume 3? I can't remember. Capital Volume 1. Anyway, the idea that you sort of kickstart industrial accumulation by drawing sources of capital from sort of almost like outside the system. And this was done most kind of on the largest scale, really, by collectivizing the whole agricultural system. So from 1953 to 1958, over 5 years, they engaged in a sort of mass collectivization of agriculture, which essentially took away from the peasants any control over what they were farming and how they were farming, on where the surplus of their agriculture was going. So the main mechanism for this was to sort of compulsorily purchase agricultural surplus at low prices from the collective farms, but also actually to provide the farms with the inputs, to provide them with the plans of what they should be growing, and so on and so on. Essentially, to turn almost the entire farming sector in the space of a few years into a sort of proletarian, capitalist agricultural system. There's a lot of other ecological stuff that goes with that, which is what I'm writing about at the moment, which I could talk about, but I won't mention it at this point. Another feature of North Korea's industrialization drive after the war in the 1950s was what I would call sort of extreme productivism. In a sense, production and productivity became the be all and end all of life in the DPRK in the 1950s. I mean, this took the form of things like introducing peace rates. Again, this was copying something that the Russians had done, the Soviets had done in the 1930s. Constant speed up campaigns, Stakhanovist production campaigns, economization campaigns, you name it. There was just constantly, if you were a worker in North Korea in the 1950s, your entire life revolved around basically having as much value squeezed out of you as possible, and you had to be an enthusiastic participant in that process. I mean, because of the research I've been doing for a book I'm writing now, I've been reading quite a lot of North Korean media, journals, magazines, newspapers from the 1950s and early 60s. And it's just incredible the extent to which this kind of productivism dominated everything. I mean, absolutely everything was dominated by the need to produce more with less. Okay, I'm going to just skip on a bit and talk a bit about because I'm probably got another. We got another 5 minutes or so, Pete. So
Yeah, yeah,
yeah, okay. Um, I mean, I wanted to say something about China. I'll have to keep that very brief. There's a very interesting chapter in this book by another Korean socialist, Yong Kim, which is about China. It's based on his own original research in primary sources from the 1950s China, and he the argument he makes in the end is just the extent to which we have some myths about this period of China that somehow, it was the age of the iron rice bowl. That is the idea that if you were a worker in industry, you could have a very stable, secure job, and you could, maybe you didn't live extremely well, but you could have a sort of guaranteed income and food on the table and so on. He's arguing that that's actually not true, or not true to the extent that people have claimed, and that the um, Chinese state in the late 1950s or 50s, late 1950s was already a very state capitalist state. It was engaged in trying to raise productivity, also trying to calculate productivity against other um, global capitalist states in such a way that it could kind of ascertain what you might call the international socially necessary labor time in order to understand, just the extent to which it was up to global standards and so on. It's a very interesting argument he makes. I'm not sure I'm doing it great justice right now. But in the process of this, the Chinese state was also, frequently engaged in mass layoffs, in keeping wages down as much as possible. Again, the introduction of peace rates, which happened in North Korea at this time as well. So yeah, that's all I'm going to say about that. I thought I'd just finish off, I'm kind of running out of time, I know, but I just finish off by just a little bit of comparison between North Korea and China, I guess, because I think perhaps one of the things people may be curious about is why did these two countries end up being so different? They came from quite a similar place in certain ways. They were born at about the same time, within a year or so of each other. But and they both basically adopted the Stalinist model of industrialization, basically the Stalinist state capitalist model. But they ended up quite different. I mean, there's some very obvious answers to this in the sense that one is an absolutely massive, sort of almost subcontinent size country with whatever it is now, 1.4 billion people or something. And North Korea is only one half of a pretty small peninsula, which has about 25 million people. So they're very difficult to compare in that sense. Um, but I think one of the things that has to be pointed out immediately about North Korea is that it has always been one half of a partitioned country, and that it has been engaged permanently in a state of competition and kind of almost like near warfare at all times with its other half, and that creates a very particular kind of country. Another thing to also just mention before I finish, I think, is that the decisive change that China made in the beginning in the late 1970s was a change to turn outwards to a kind of internationalization of its state capitalist model, to bring in investments from outside, to create, to begin to produce for an international market for export and so on. And to privatize some parts of the economy as well. And that was a decisive change that was made, and it turned out to be successful for the Chinese ruling class. Um, North Korea did not do that. I think again that comes back down to the what I've said about it being part of a partitioned country. That's largely for that reason. Although it is worth just noting that in the early 1970s, North Korea did for a little while try to turn outwards and to sort of begin to internationalize its state capitalism a little bit. But unfortunately, it did it exactly the moment when the first oil shock happened, caused a massive, international recession, and this meant that the value of its exports plummeted. It was exporting minerals. Value of its exports plummeted, and it found itself in a big debt trap. And it has actually never paid off the debts to various countries that it owes from the early 1970s. If I had my slides up, I would show you a slide of the famous Volvos of Pyongyang, In about 1974, 73, 74, North Korea established diplomatic relations with Sweden. One of the first things it did was to buy, I think, 1,000 Volvos from Sweden, but it never paid for them. Apparently, if you look around carefully in Pyongyang to this day, you can still see the odd Volvo around. I guess they're like those sort of, they're like the North Korean version of those amazing American cars in Havana or something like that. Anyway, North Korea, as I said, did never was successful in internationalizing and has to this day been sort of stuck in a kind of autarkic loop, which it has kind of turned into a virtue, I suppose, by calling it juche and making it into a kind of um, sort of raising it to the level of an ideology, I suppose. Yeah. Anyway, I'm going to stop there because I've already gone on too long, and Gareth's going to say a few things.
Thanks, Owen. That was brilliant. Okay, Gareth, do you want to come in just for a few minutes and then we'll open up the discussion?
Sure, sure, happy to do that. Well, first off, just want to say what a this is a wonderful book. It's a really, really um, incredible amount of work Owen put into it, and gathering together comrades from East Asia to produce chapters on various countries, to compare different forms that state capitalism takes in different historical periods in different countries and so on. I mean, it's I wonder, has it been reviewed for RS21? Is there anyone from the website here? It would be great to see a review of it. Maybe it has been, and I've just been not noticing. Um, so as somebody said, I'm going to be focusing in the next meeting about the book on more theoretical questions, not just looking at Russia, mainly looking really at the world system as a whole, because state capitalism is an element within every part of the system. There's not just certain state capitalist models. It's a principle in a sense of that permeates the system. So I'll be talking a little bit more theoretically next time. So just now, in the few minutes I have, I'm going to do the opposite and talk about my own experience. So in order to prepare for this meeting, I went over to China last month. I mean, it was for other reasons as well, but and it's a fascinating country to visit. I mean, I was struck by. I'll just want to share a few impressions with you. I mean, the caveat is, of course, these are impressions, but we can discuss. One is that, walking around Chinese cities, you're struck by just how similar in some ways, in many ways, it is to the Western developmental model, the Western urban model. America and China feel to me very, very similar. They're built on very similar material foundations, as all capitalist countries pretty much. A lot of concrete, a lot of coal for energy, a lot of cars. It's a very profligate developmental model, very high carbon emissions. I mean, China per capita, China's carbon emissions are higher than Britain's um, these days. It's a kind of breakneck development model. Nothing can, like in America, nothing can be allowed to get in the way of business. There are, of course, some differences. It's as Owen mentioned, these are economies very heavily geared to accumulation and away from consumption, more than in the United States, even. Um, there are some impressionistic differences as well. There's more public transport in China, obviously, than in the US. But that's one little impression I had. I spoke to a lot of people, and I was in Beijing on this visit, and you're struck very strongly at what a incredibly polarized society China is. There's incredible polarization between the poor and the rich, and between the cities and the countryside. Um, if you have the bad luck to be born in the countryside and you migrate to the city, and then you have children, your children will not be allowed to move to the city. So there's a barrier enclosing the better off city folk and protecting them against the incursion from the countryside. Um, the ban on bringing children with you to the cities is really quite an astonishing restriction on peasant mobility. So you have the fascinating irony in China that this was a peasant revolution, so-called, which has led to the absolute domination of the cities over the countryside. Um, I was struck in China by how astonishingly controlled and oppressive this society is. There is no oppositional discussion except in very small groups, was the impression I got and what people were telling me. Um, and uh, so it's everywhere you go, you are aware that the state forces are controlling society in an incredibly detailed way and very effectively as well. They, at the moment, I mean, there have been explosions as a couple of years ago in the November protests that began in Urumqi in Xinjiang and spread outwards. There can be explosions. There will be. There is obviously a lot of discontent, especially among young people. Um, but it remains an exceptionally controlled society. I was struck too by talking to supporters of the regime, which particularly at universities where I was at. I was at a couple of universities in Beijing, and um, it's fascinating asking people what they think communism is and what is communist about China. The first responses I got were along the lines, well, it's a fairly state-directed society and economy, and to which I would reply, well, Britain was in the Second World War. Does that mean Britain went communist during the Second World War? And weren't sure how to answer that. The next response was, well, we have some level of quite a high level of public transport. Yeah, we do in Britain as well. And some of the, health and education, they're largely state run. Yeah, yeah, in Britain as well. And and then eventually my interlocutors, students basically, regime supporting students, ended up by saying, well, they think the essence of communism really is that there's not much criminality in China. The streets are relatively stay safe, unlike in the West, where you're likely to be not knifed or mugged if you walk down London streets. So there's a very, very, as we all are aware, there's a very strong level of support among the middle classes and the beneficiaries of the system for this communist project. But there's precious little at that lay level. There's communism basically means just the existing order and not much more than that. It reminded me of living in East Germany, where you'd get similar answers to this sort of question. Um, so yeah, I'm they were just a few anecdotal remarks based on a recent visit, but I'll leave it at that and look forward to questions and discussion.
Can I come back on a couple of things very quickly? I know we should let other people say things.
Yes, of course you can.
Yeah, it was just interesting what you say. And when you said, well, the final thing they were left with was to say that lack of criminality. Well, then I would say, well, I guess Singapore is also communist and South Korea is also communist because I mean South Korea there may be all kinds of criminality, but it's not a country where you experience criminal violence on a day-to-day. No, it's not something like you're not afraid of those kind of things. It's a safe country, as people like to say in that sense. So. But and also on the what's the other thing I was going to say? Oh, it'll come to me in a minute. Maybe I'll just I'll let other people say things.